In most disappearances, something breaks. A window, a lock, a routine that suddenly, inexplicably, stops. Someone doesn't show up. Someone doesn't call. Someone leaves behind the one thing they would never leave behind. And investigators follow that break, that fracture in the normal, to find what happened. But what do you do when nothing breaks? When the door is still locked? When the belongings are still there? When the house looks exactly the way it's supposed to look, except the person who lived in it is gone? What do you do when there is no fracture to follow? That is the question sitting at the center of a case that has quietly become one of the most forensically complex disappearances in recent American history. And tonight, we are going to take it apart, not to sensationalize it, not to speculate, but to understand it. Because understanding how a case like this works, understanding what investigators look for, what they find, what they can't explain, tells us something important. Not just about this case, about how people disappear, and about how cases like this one either get solved or quietly don't. Stay with me. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in a home in the Catalina foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. She had a pacemaker. She required daily medication. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable television journalists in the country, lived far away. On the morning of February 1, 2026, Nancy was gone. Her phone was inside the house. Her medication was untouched. Her personal belongings were exactly where they belonged. No packed bag. No note. No indication that she had chosen to leave. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. Just absence. Clean, complete, and unexplained. That last detail, no forced entry, is the part of this case that investigators keep coming back to. And it is the part that most of the public coverage has moved past too quickly. Because it is not a minor detail. It is in some ways the entire case. If you've been following Unresolved years, subscribe now and turn on notifications if you haven't. This channel is built for the viewer who wants to understand these cases at a level that goes beyond what the headlines offer. Now let's get into it. To understand why the no forced entry detail matters so much in the Nancy Guthrie case, you need to understand something about how missing persons investigations actually work. Not the way they work in crime dramas, the way they work in reality. When a person disappears, the first thing investigators do is establish the perimeter. Not a physical perimeter, a conceptual one. They ask, where was the last confirmed point of contact? What was the last verified moment this person existed in the world in a way that can be documented? In the Nancy Guthrie case, that perimeter is the home itself. The last confirmed evidence that Nancy was inside that house, alive and present, is the pacemaker monitoring data. The application on her phone that tracked her device's connection to her cardiac implant. That connection went dark at 2:28 in the morning on February 1st Street. Before that, the Nest camera at the front of the property had detected activity. A figure, approaching the porch. Dressed for concealment. Gloves on. A face covering. A firearm visible at the front of the holster. A backpack with reflective straps. That figure tried to block the camera. First with a gloved hand. Then, with foliage pulled from the yard. Then, when neither worked, they removed the camera entirely. But the footage had already been captured. And through cloud backup technology, investigators were able to recover it, even after the physical device was gone. One person. On the porch. Before the connection went dark. That is the perimeter. But here is where it gets complicated. The figure on the porch appeared at the front of the property. The timeline between the camera interaction and the moment the pacemaker app disconnected, approximately 42 minutes. Which means whatever happened inside that house, it took a long time. Too long for a simple grab and go. Too long for something purely impulsive. That 42 minutes is one of the most analytically significant details in this case. And most of the coverage has barely touched it. Because 42 minutes is not urgency. It is not panic. It is not someone acting on impulse. 42 minutes is deliberate. What happens in a house for 42 minutes between the arrival of an intruder and the disappearance of a victim? That question doesn't have a confirmed answer, but the shape of the answer tells investigators something specific. Someone who spends 42 minutes in a target's home before leaving with them is someone who knew what they were doing, who had a plan, who perhaps encountered resistance, the kind that takes time to manage. And that brings us to the blood. On the front porch of the Guthrie home, blood was found. Forensic blood spatter analysis of the patterns visible in images from the scene suggests, and this is analytical inference, not confirmed fact, that the blood was deposited by someone who was close to ground level, who coughed or aspirated blood, who was, at that moment, on their knees or hunched forward with their face near the surface. The droplet patterns, the hollow rings left by aerated blood, blood that has passed through the respiratory system, the near-circular shape of the largest droplets, indicating a stationary source rather than a moving one. All of it is consistent with one interpretation. Nancy Guthrie was struck at the threshold of her own home. She went down. She was then picked up and carried, face upward, so the blood no longer fell forward, toward a waiting vehicle. One person, 42 minutes. Blood at the threshold. That is what the physical evidence records. But now let's talk about what the physical evidence does not explain. How did they get inside? No forced entry means one of three things. The first possibility, the door was opened by Nancy herself. She let someone in, which means she either knew the person or was deceived into opening the door to someone she had no reason to distrust. At 2 in the morning, which raises its own questions. The second possibility, someone had access to the property without requiring permission. A key, a code, a security system credential, someone whose access to that home was pre-existing, not gained on the night of January 31st, but built into the fabric of Nancy's daily life long before. The third possibility, the entry point was not the front door. The property had rear access that investigators noted was found open, the back doors propped, in a way that suggested advanced preparation. Someone who had been inside the home before and knew its layout. Who knew which exit to prepare, which door to prop, which camera to approach, and which to avoid. All three possibilities have one thing in common. They require prior knowledge, not guesswork, not luck, knowledge. The person responsible for the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, whatever their motive, knew things about that property that a stranger would not know. They knew where the camera was. They knew how long they had. They knew the layout well enough to operate inside it for 42 minutes. That knowledge came from somewhere, and wherever it came from is, in all likelihood, where the investigation finds its answer. Let's talk about how knowledge like that gets built. Because this is the part of disappearance cases that most people don't think about. The part that happens before. Sometimes days before. Sometimes weeks. Sometimes months. Investigators use the term pre-incident behavior to describe the observable actions a perpetrator takes in the period leading up to a crime. In a targeted abduction, which this appears to be, the Pima County Sheriff himself confirmed the word targeted in his early public statements. Pre-incident behavior is almost always present. It shows up in different forms. A vehicle observed in the neighborhood more than once. A figure who appears in 2 or 3 different witnesses' peripheral memories. Not threatening, not memorable, but present. A face that shows up in proximity to the target's daily routine without an obvious reason to be there. This is what investigators call pre-incident behavior. The reconnaissance phase. In the Guthrie case, witness accounts from the surrounding area in the weeks before February 1st have been collected and analyzed. Some of those accounts describe a figure or a vehicle that seemed slightly out of place. Not enough to call police, not enough to remember clearly, but enough to create a low-level sense that something in the environment had shifted. That is the signature of a targeted crime. Not randomness, pattern. And there is another form of pre-incident behavior that is specific to modern disappearances. Digital behavior. The device in the perpetrator's pocket records a location history. The platforms they use create a trail. The purchases they make, the backpack, the gloves, the face covering, the firearm holster, all of them documented in that Nest footage. Those items were bought somewhere. By someone. Through a transaction that left a record. Forensic investigators don't just analyze the crime scene. They build backward through time. They look for the purchases, the searches, the movements in the weeks before. The question is not just who was on that porch on the night of January 31st Street. The question is what that person was doing on January 24th, on January 10th, on December 15th. That backward timeline is where most cases like this eventually break open. Now let me expand the frame for a moment. Because the Nancy Guthrie disappearance does not exist in a vacuum. The architecture of this case, a wealthy, elderly woman vanished from a secured home with no forced entry, blood at the threshold, a ransom demand that behaved strangely, has appeared in American crime files before, in ways that are specific enough to be instructive. In 1988, in Jackson, Mississippi, a woman named Annie Laurie Hearin, 72 years old, wife of one of the state's wealthiest businessmen, was taken from her home. Blood was found near the front door. A ransom note was left. Her husband paid nearly $1 million. She was never returned. Never found. The man eventually convicted in connection with the plot. An attorney with a business grievance against the family had conducted extensive pre-attack surveillance of the property. Photographs of the access points. A map of the routines. A plan built from knowledge, not improvisation. In 1977, in suburban Chicago, Helen Brach, the wealthiest woman in America to ever disappear without a trace, vanished after a routine medical appointment. The last person known to have had contact with her was her trusted houseman, a man with keys to every room, knowledge of every routine, access to every part of her life. He was never charged. He died without saying what he knew. In both cases, the perpetrator's access to the victim's world was not incidental. It was structural. It was built into the victim's life over time, through a professional relationship, through routine contact, through the kind of accumulated knowledge that only comes from sustained presence. The question the Nancy Guthrie investigation is working to answer is the same question those earlier cases put at their center. Who had that kind of access? And here is what makes the Guthrie case different from both of those precedents. Evidence. Specifically, biological evidence. A strand of hair, recovered from inside Nancy's bedroom, confirmed by the sheriff's own public statement as stranger DNA. Not Nancy's. Not anyone identified as a known occupant or visitor. That hair is now at Astrea Forensics in Santa Cruz, California. The laboratory whose rootless hair analysis contributed to the conviction of Rex Heuermann, the Long Island serial killer. The laboratory that developed the SNP extraction technique that was, until recently, considered impossible. If the analysis produces a usable genetic profile, forensic genealogists will run it against public DNA databases. They will find partial matches. They will build family trees from those matches. And they will trace those trees through birth certificates, through property records, through the documented human connective tissue of American life, until a name emerges. A name that can be tested against everything else investigators have built over the course of this case. The surveillance footage, the behavioral profile, the pre-incident witness accounts, the timeline of purchases and movements, every thread of the investigation anchored to one person. That is what one hair can do. But here is the part of this case that I think gets lost in the day-to-day coverage. The part that matters most when you step back and look at the whole picture. We are now at a point in forensic science where cases like this, cases that would have been consigned to a cold file in 1988, in 1977, in 1992, are solvable in ways they were not before. The genetic genealogy technology that could have identified Annie Laurie Hearin's abductor did not exist in 1988. The SNP extraction methodology that could have analyzed the evidence in the Brach case did not exist in 1977. The cloud-based security footage recovery that produced the Nest camera images in the Guthrie case did not exist in any meaningful form a decade ago. What this means, and this is the central argument of this entire episode, is that we are living through a specific moment in forensic history. A window where the tools are finally sophisticated enough to close cases that would have previously stayed open, where the biological trace left behind by someone who believed they had been careful enough can be extracted, amplified, and matched to a living person. That window is open right now, and the Nancy Guthrie investigation is operating inside it. If you are finding this kind of analysis valuable, subscribe to Unresolved Years now. Turn on notifications. Hit the like button. This channel covers cases like this one, with the forensic depth they deserve, and every subscriber makes it possible to keep doing it. Now let me close with the part of this case that I think matters most. The Nancy Guthrie case is not just a story about one woman and one disappearance. It is a case study in how people vanish. Not randomly, not through chaotic impulse, through preparation, through knowledge that was accumulated over time and then used. The locked door that should have been a barrier was not a barrier, because someone had already spent weeks or months making sure it would not be. The 42 minutes inside that home were not chaos. They were the execution of a plan. The blood on the porch was not the beginning of the crime. It was the end of a long preparation. And the silence that followed, the silence that has defined this case for over 80 days, is not the silence of an investigation that has gone cold. It is the silence of investigators who have learned, from decades of cases exactly like this one, that the worst thing you can do at this stage is speak too soon. Because every word they say publicly is a word the responsible party can use to build a defense. And the responsible party, based on everything the behavioral evidence tells us, is still watching, still listening, still calculating whether they have been careful enough. Here is the thing about people who prepare like this. They are usually not careful enough. They leave the reflective straps on the backpack. They choose a face covering that breathes and sheds. They hold their gloved hand over the camera lens for long enough that the angle reveals a wrist. They spend 42 minutes inside a house when they should have spent 12. And they leave one strand of hair in a room they entered believing no one would ever know they were there. The science exists to read that strand. The investigative infrastructure exists to follow it. And the precedent, the long, painful precedent of cases like Annie Laurie Hearin, like Brach, like the Springfield 3, exists to remind us what happens when the answer doesn't come. Nancy Guthrie deserves the answer. Her family deserves the answer. And the answer may already be embedded in the evidence being processed in a laboratory right now. That is what this case reveals about how people disappear. Not through randomness, not through chance, through the patient, deliberate accumulation of access, and sometimes through the patient, deliberate accumulation of forensic evidence. That access gets traced back to its source. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit an anonymous tip at tips.fbi.gov. A reward of over $1 million remains available. If this episode made you think differently about this case or about how disappearances work, share it with one person. Subscribe if you haven't. Unresolved Years will be here for every development that follows. The door was locked, the house was quiet, and somewhere in the forensic record of that night, the truth is waiting. I'm Webb. Thank you for watching.